Sometimes there are advantages to not remembering things, and there are advantages to having an audience of people who don't always necessarily remember things, particularly when it comes to telling a joke. In Tuesday class, we can tell the same joke about 4 times over the course of one of our semesters, and we laugh every time because we've all forgotten it. But this is something I think I shared some time back on one of our question and answers nights, but I just want to share it again. And it is about the raging debate that many scholars, linguistic scholars, have had regarding Numbers chapter 22. What language did Balaam's donkey speak? And they've narrowed it down to 2 possibilities: Assyrian or Hebraic. So we're not sure which one it is, but maybe one day they'll resolve that. So let's move on to our more serious questions tonight for question and answers. Originally, we would have done this last week, but we were very blessed last week to have Kazu speak for us. I was very impressed by the things that he had to say, the very humble manner in which he presented them, and I know that it was a great blessing for each and every one of us, and we counted it a privilege to be here that night to hear such inspirational and encouraging words regarding studying and reading the Bible. But we have 2 questions that we want to deal with tonight, and the first one comes from 2 Samuel chapter 12. And if you want to be turning there, we're going to read verse 31 in just a moment. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 31. Really, the context of what we're going to look at begins, at least the immediate context, begins in verse 26. And in verse 26 of 2 Samuel 12, it tells us that Joab fought against Rabbah of the people of Ammon, the Ammonites, people we're familiar with in our study of the Bible, and took the royal city. And we learned that he sends word to David because David is not there, and that goes back to the larger context of the opening verse of chapter 11, actually, that we'll refer to in a moment. But he sends word to David that Joab has conquered the city, and he wants David to come, lest he calls the city by his own name. David, in verse 29, we're told, gathers all the people together, takes some more reinforcements with him, and went to Rabbah, fought against it, and took it. We read in verse 30 where he took the crown and put it on his own head from the king of Ammon. And then verse 31 is the subject of our question tonight. And he brought out the people who were in it, the people in the city of Rabbah, the Ammonites. He brought out the people who were in it and put them to work, and this is the New King James that I'm reading from, put them to work with saws and iron picks and iron axes, and made them cross over to the brickworks or the brick kilns. So he did to all the cities of the people of Ammon. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. The King James Version says he put them under the saws and iron picks. There's a parallel passage that is important for us to read as we study this to our text this evening. And when we look at the parallel passage, it is in 1 Chronicles chapter 20. If you would, turn for just a moment to 1 Chronicles chapter 20 and listen to the wording that is here, and then I'll actually read the question because we haven't even read the question yet. We're just bringing the verse to our attention that we might put the question in its proper context. But in the first 3 verses of 1 Chronicles chapter 20, we read this same incident recorded about the overthrow and conquering of Rabbah by Joab and eventually David as well. And in verse 3 of 1 Chronicles, we read that he, David, brought out the people who were in it, and then the New King James Version says, and put them to work with saws and iron picks and with axes. So David did to all the cities of the people of Ammon. However, in the New King James, there is a footnote about this that refers to a center column reference that is found in the King James, a translation that is found in the King James and some other versions as well. I think it's footnoted in a large number of versions that the text would read that he brought the people who were in it and cut them with saws and iron picks and with axes. And when you come back to our passage where the question comes from in 2 Samuel 12, putting them under the axes and the iron picks, paralleled with the reading that he cut them with axes and iron picks in 1 Chronicles, leads us to the conclusion that there was some very violent retaliation against the Ammonites on this occasion. In reading the question now from our context, 2 Samuel 12:31, the person who asked the question says, "This sounds like Hitler. Help me with this. Is this why he wasn't allowed to build the temple? Was God pleased with this in 2 Samuel 12 or not?" And indeed, when you read it, and you read it with the interpretation of, or the understanding that he cut them, he put them under saws and axes, it does sound a great deal about like Hitler and some things we learn about the atrocities that occurred then. And so the person asking the question says, "Help me with this. It is a difficult, it's a challenging passage any way we approach it. Is this why he was not allowed to build the temple?" In 1 Chronicles 22, verse 8, when David is preparing his son Solomon to build the temple, in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 8, David himself says, "I was minded to build the temple, however, God told me that I could not because I had shed much blood." Now, when Nathan the prophet tells David that he can make the preparations for the temple but not build it, I don't think there's a reference in Nathan's discourse or exchange with David that Nathan actually says those words, but apparently God told David that at some point. And David was told by God that he would not be allowed to build the tabernacle because he had shed much blood, because he was such a man of war. And Solomon repeats that himself in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 3, as the temple is being built. And we see that David did receive a message, a very clear message, that he would not be allowed to build the temple because of his violent bloodshed and the war that he had been involved in and the shedding of blood that this, of course, necessitated. Does that tie in? Does that statement made to David tie in with what we've just read in 2 Samuel 12 and 1 Chronicles chapter 20 about that he perhaps cut and put the people under saws and iron picks in this way? Not all translations, the New King James that I'm reading from, translate it the way with cut. They say that he worked them. The NIV says that he consigned or was consigning them to labor, consigning the people to labor. The definition of the word in the original language in 2 Samuel 12, in our English Bibles for put, or put them under, the phrase means to appoint or to charge or to commit. Like we might use the phrase, "I'm going to put you to work," or "I'm going to put you under the grindstone." Well, we understand that to be a little bit of a figure of speech in that way. So let's take an approach to answering this question as the person says, "Help me with this. Was God pleased with this or not?" What actually happened here? What actually took place on this particular occasion? Well, there are two possibilities that you will read in commentaries and works on these particular verses. One school of thought is more along the line of putting them to work, and we'll say a little more about that in a moment. I'm just giving you the schools of thought. The other school of thought is literally that he cut these people. He was as a retaliation for the war and so on, that these people were killed or at least seriously injured in this way. Those are the two schools of thought on it. Let's see why those exist. Number one, is it possible that the meaning here is not as severe, not as harsh, not as awful as we might be led to think from reading the text? And I say that because some translations do, instead of translating it as cut or put them under, put them to work. as the word might possibly mean, as to appoint someone, to charge someone, to commit someone to a particular behavior. Here's the deal. Now, I am not a Hebrew scholar by any means, do not claim to be, and I don't think I ever will claim to be. But the word that is used in the original, the phrase that is used in the original in 2 Samuel, the word that is used in 2 Samuel 12, that most of our English Bible says put them, and the word that is used in 1 Chronicles 20 where it says cut them, the words there basically for put and cut in the original, they differ from one another by only one part of a single letter. I don't know Hebrew, but you can look at different works on this and you can see the words laid out side by side in the actual Hebrew language, and the symbols look identical to one another, except one letter has an extra swoop on it, you might say, has an extra leg on it. We do that in English. For instance, you're going to make the letter T. That involves a vertical line and a horizontal line. But if you leave off the horizontal line, what have you got? An L. The letter C, the letter E is you go around and you have a slash through it, right? But what if you forgot to make the slash? What do you got? The letter C. And that happens in English. It happens sometimes in the transcribing of the Scriptures. Not a mistake by inspiration, but when the scribes were copying these things, sometimes part of a letter, like we leave the horizontal part off of a T and accidentally make an L, or we leave the slash out of an E and we accidentally make a letter C. Sometimes that happens, and most of the time that is not of much consequence. That is not of much difficulty. And so there is the possibility that what you have going on here is that one of the texts either left off a swoop or they added one. The question is, which one? Which way does it go? Should it be put, as in put them to work, or should it be cut, as in an act of retaliation in war? Which direction should it go? Well, that, of course, is where the debate might be. There are those who say, it's very difficult to think of David committing such an atrocity like this, and that such a terrible thing would happen. And they, of course, are very favorable toward the interpretation that it means put them under, as in put them to work, or as the NIV says, he consigned them to work with the axes and the picks and in the brick kilns. One plausible credence lended to that is that in David's day, the city of Jerusalem was expanding, and he would have needed workers to help with that expansion and the projects that would be occurring. And here was a ready-made bunch of people for free labor, and they could be digging out and preparing for the expansions of the city, making the bricks in the brick kilns. And so that lends some credence to the possibility that might be a very valid interpretation, because the Hebrew word for cut them is only different from put them with part of the final letter. There is also something very intriguing when you read forward a little bit in 1 Chronicles chapter 17. 1 Chronicles 17. I believe I'm referring you to the right place there. Is it 2 Samuel? Let me look just a second here. No, it is 2 Samuel. I'm sorry. In 2 Samuel chapter 17, we read something kind of interesting in a time where David is on the run because of the rebellion of Absalom. And during this time of rebellion from Absalom, as David is on the run, and some of his enemies, Shimei, for instance, in chapter 16, are trying to make things even worse for David. They're trying to kick a man while he's down. In 2 Samuel 17, verse 27, you read about a man named Shobi, S-H-O-B-B-I, some translations have, and some only have one B in the word. The son of Nahash from Rabbah of the people of Ammon, and he is highlighted there as among 2 or 3 men who are helping David. Now, if David had really committed such an awful atrocity against the people of Ammon, why would someone from that city give even 3 seconds thought to helping him in the future? And again, this does lead some degree of credence to the interpretation that maybe it does mean put them under work rather than slaughtering them or killing them, as we do read or as would be interpreted if we take the word to be cut. Well, that's one interpretation. Here's the other one. And rather than saying that the passage in 2 Samuel is the correct word, the correct letter in the word, and that it means put them under, the parallel in 2 Chronicles 20 is deemed to be the appropriate letter in the appropriate word, and that it does mean cut them. And that David did these things with retaliation in a setting of war. It's not just that David got up one day and says, I think I'm just going to take the chariot out here, and the first city I come to, I'm just going to whack a bunch of people up with axes. It's not like he did that. He was in the middle of conquest. He was in the middle of war. These were sworn enemies. These were idolaters. And so we have to put this in the setting, whichever interpretation you go with, you have to put it in the setting that it is in a period of war and defense of the nation of Israel. But the interpretation being that it really does mean cut, and that we see this kind of retaliation against these individuals, has some credence to it as well. Number one, we know that David is capable of being a fearless, bloodshedding warrior. David is capable of such cruelty, if you will. You may recall that very early in his life, before he was even king, the little taunt song that was developed between him and Saul by the people was that Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain what? 10,000s. Now, there could be some exaggeration in that, a little bit of hyperbole, but apparently he was responsible for the deaths of many of the enemies of the people of Israel. Bloodshed. We also see that David was told by God, as we have referred to a moment ago, in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 8, David out of his own mouth says, God told me I can't build the tabernacle because I've shed much blood. So there is no question to what? Fact. David killed a lot of people. David was responsible for the deaths of a lot of people. Now, primarily, they were the enemies of Israel. They were idolaters. They were people who were punished because of their rebellion against God. But David was responsible for their deaths. And we understand that to be the case even from David's own mouth about what God said the reason was that he couldn't build the tabernacle. A little further proof of this, if you will, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 27 for just a minute. And in 1 Samuel chapter 27, King Saul is still alive, but in hot pursuit of David. David has, by the providence of God and the blessing of God, has evaded Saul and Saul's sword many times. But David realizes that as long as Saul is alive, this is just going to be a cat and mouse game continually. David cannot bring himself as many lives as he had taken, as many deaths as he was responsible for. David could not even bring the life of Saul, which would have pretty much put an end to everything. But he could not bring himself to do that, so for a period of time, David lived among the Philistines. Again, the sworn enemies of God's people. But David just packed up camp and took it down and lived a little south with the Philistines. And while he was there to stay in the graces of the ruler of the Philistines and to kind of keep himself safe there, because he knew if he went back up to where Saul was, it's just problems up there. To keep him safe there, he and his men went on a lot of military expeditions. And we see, when we read a few verses I'm going to call your attention to in a moment in this chapter, that David was capable of shedding blood and taking the lives of many people. And when we read that text over in 1 Chronicles 20, and it says he cut them, and we think about David killing these people or having these people, not that he single-handedly killed every one of them, but they had it arranged for them to die with this very violent, cruel death. You know, it sends a little bit of a shiver down our spine. It's just almost revolting to think about. But you know, that's not the only place we read about something in regard to David that ought to do that to us. Because while the one that we're studying right now may be slightly questionable, does it mean cut or put them to work? Let me read one to you that means definitively he killed people. 1 Samuel chapter 27. If you would, look at verses 8 through 11. When David and his men went up and raided the Gershurites, the Girzites, you know, on the Beverly Hillbillies, Jethro Bodine opened a restaurant one time and he called it the Happy Gizzard. So I feel like I'm reading about that right now, although we're on something very serious. And the Amalekites, for those nations were the inhabitants of the land from old as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. Remember, David was down south with the Philistines. Whenever David attacked the land, now listen, whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive. He took away the sheep and the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned them to Achish. And Achish would say, "Where have you made a raid today?" And David would say, "Against the southern area of Judah, or against the southern area of the Jerahmeelites, or against the southern area of the Kenites." And David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, "Thus David did." And this was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. Now, while we might debate a little bit about the question that we're dealing with tonight from 2 Samuel 12 and 1 Chronicles chapter 20, does it mean put them under work or cut them and kill them? There is no debate here. David was responsible for the deaths of many, many, many people, men, and notice the text specifies twice, and women. That sends a chill down your spine. That's not a pleasant thought to think about. The man that we revere so much, and is called in the Bible the one after God's own heart. And I think that's why the person is saying, you know, help me with this in the question, because we do have so much respect for David. He has such a high place, but we must remember he was an imperfect human being. And the point I'm trying to make here is that David was capable of doing things like this. And to reaffirm that one more time, turn to 2 Samuel chapter 8. And in 2 Samuel chapter 8, this is after Saul has died. David has been anointed king. And this is before the incident that we're reading about in chapter 12, just like the one we just read about while he was down in the Philistine territory, was before what we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 12. Well, before what happened in 2 Samuel chapter 12, we read in 2 Samuel 8, we're in 2 Samuel 8, showing that David was capable of bloodshed and so on. And it's you know, kind of an unpleasant thing to think about. After this, 2 Samuel 8, verse 1, after this, it came to pass, David attacked the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Metheg Ammah from the hand of the Philistines. Then he defeated Moab, forcing them down to the ground. He measured them off in a line. With 2 lines he measured off those to be put to death, and with 1 full line those to be kept alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants, those who survived, and brought tribute. And so the picture we have here of David is that when he conquered the Moabites, he lined them up on the ground. Now, I don't know if this means the men and the women or just the men of war. It doesn't specify. It just says the Moabites. And he lined them on the ground so many per line, I suppose, or whatever a distance was. And every third line of people on the ground survived, but 2/3 did not. That was at David's word, at David's plan, at David's command. And so we know, this incident about the question tonight in 2 Samuel 12, we know before that in 2 Samuel 8 and in 1 Samuel 27, he has shown that he can take the lives of many, many people, almost seemingly in a business-like fashion. He was a warrior. That's the side of David that we don't often stress. He was a fighter. Even from a youth, he was capable of killing wild animals barehanded. He was a fighter. And God himself, and David himself said, God said this, he shed much blood. And when you begin to take the weight of all that evidence together, you begin to think that perhaps the interpretation that David took the lives of the Ammonites in this act of war and retaliation for war is a very valid interpretation. Now, let's come back to our text in 2 Samuel 12, and I want you to notice something that I think helps us understand the context a little bit and maybe David's mindset. In chapter 11, verse 1, chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "It happened in the spring of the year at the time when kings go out to battle that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon." That's also very telling, isn't it? They destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Now, in the rest of chapter 11 and a great deal of chapter 12, what do we read about David? The sin with Bathsheba, the massive cover-up, the sin of having Uriah murdered, and then the death of the child, and then the birth eventually of another child with David and Bathsheba. When you put all of that together, that's going to add up to close to 2 years at a minimum. They had one child, died. She conceives again and have another child, name him Solomon. So you've got, a year and a half of her with child, some space before and in between. You've got maybe as much as a couple of years there. Are we to understand that 2 Samuel 11, verse 1 and 2 Samuel 12, verse 26 are 2 years apart? Probably not. Probably what is happening here is because this story of David took place at this time, and this happens more than one place in the Bible, Old Testament particularly, when a history is being given and then there's a personal incident or there's something that needs more details given, the author of the Scriptures, through the inspiration of the Spirit, will veer off from the main story long enough to tell the details of the smaller story and then return to the big story. And apparently that's what's happening here. And apparently, while David should have been in the battle with Rabbah, and David should have been there and was not, he's conducted himself so very sinfully, and he's got himself in a big mess. What is his state of mind by the time Joab calls on him and says, "Hey, you need to come down here and help us finish the job"? How much time had passed? Had enough time passed for David to have committed the sin with Bathsheba, to cover it up, and maybe for Uriah to die? That's not a long period of time right there. That was all at the beginning of this whole incident. Is it very possible that by the point that David comes down to Rabbah, which was probably not 2 years later, But by the time David comes down to there, he is so earlobe deep in his sin. His conscience is so going crazy about the cover-up that he's trying to orchestrate in killing Uriah and then marrying Bathsheba, and all these things are going on, that all of a sudden Joab says, "Yoo-hoo, come down here and help us." David goes down there, and because of his state of mind, his aching conscience, he just says, "I'm going to kill everything in my way." And he wholesale slaughters those people. They would have been punished. They likely would have been died. At the very least, they would have been prisoners of war anyway. But I wonder if David's state of mind, because of the horrible sin that he is trying to cover up, the broken relationship he has with God right now, is a very determining factor in the way that he handled all of this situation. And that it was an atrocity, that it was violent, that it was bloodshed. And could this be just another contributing factor to why God said to David, "You can't build the tabernacle because you've shed much blood"? It's one thing when he did it in defense of himself and the city. It may be a very different matter to have carried this out the way David did at the time that he did. But you know what? We have other examples, don't we, of such things. In Judges chapter 1, we read about a man named Adonibezek, a king of the pagans, who, when the Israelites captured him, it says they cut off his thumbs and his toes. Sounds awfully cruel, and yet we learn that Adonibezek says, "I have done this to a lot of other kings myself." A little later in the Bible, in the book of 1 Samuel, we read about Samuel himself taking King Agag, and the Bible is very explicit here, hacking him to pieces. And then what about all this to be made of the destruction of the Canaanites when the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River into the land, and how many people they killed in the name of God? The Old Testament has a lot of violence in it. The Old Testament has a lot of bloodshed in it. David is not alone. And so I think while the interpretation of maybe it just means put them under work has some validity to it, I wouldn't just set it aside completely and scoff at it and say that's impossible. I think it has some things worthy of consideration. After studying this and thinking about it and reading it, I personally, this is just me personally, I lean toward the interpretation that David killed these people. That the valid word probably is the one in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, he cut them with these things. Because we have so many other evidences compounded on that show it, and I think maybe one of the reasons David let it go to the degree that he did is because his conscience is on fire. His relationship with God is not what it ought to be, and he took it out on these people in the cruel, cruel way that we read about. I don't know if that settles the mind and heart of anyone in regard to this, but aren't we thankful for God's grace? Aren't we thankful for God's mercy? And we must remember that David lived at a time when things like this were much more commonplace. That doesn't necessarily make them less violent. But David was operating under the system of which he was accustomed to. And was it sinful for him to do this? I don't know. Only God can answer that ultimately. But if it was, I know that eventually when David repented of his sin with Bathsheba, I have a very strong feeling that in that bag of repentance, there were a lot of items that he needed to repent of, because quite frankly, he had not been himself, spiritually speaking, for a long, long time. And God could forgive him. Now, with that in mind, let's move to our second question, and I assure you It will not take nearly as long to answer as this one has. I was glad that we only had 2 questions tonight because I could spend a great deal of time on this particular one. I thought it was worthy for us to spend this much time on it. But the second question sent to me in a text says, why is the law of Moses capitalized, the word the law of Moses capitalized in Luke 24, verse 44, when Jesus is talking with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and also in Acts 28, verse 23, where the Apostle Paul uses it, but it is not capitalized in other places. And 2 examples are given, Luke 2, verse 22, and John 7, verse 23. So the question, and this is not the entire question yet, but just to get us up to where it is. In some places, Luke 24, Acts 28, the term law of Moses is capitalized, the law of Moses. But in other places, like Luke 2 and John 7, it's not capitalized. And then in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, the phrase, the law of Christ, is not capitalized. So why would the law of Moses be capitalized sometimes and sometimes not? And why, at least in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, is the law of Christ not capitalized at all? I mean, the name Christ is capitalized, but why sometimes the word the and law are capitalized, sometimes they are not? And here, the law of Christ, the only phrase is Christ that is capitalized. Well, a couple of things here. Number one, some of that depends on what translation you're reading. In fact, the primary answer to this is a translator issue. Because various translations, I did a cross-reference of about 8 or 10 translations on these passages, and, well, it's kind of all over the map. So some did, some didn't, some did in one place and didn't in the other, and some did it the opposite of the way the question is asked. So it's a little here and a little there, and that is not so much the issue with what the actual text says or what the actual original language says, as it is what the translators have decided to do in their translation itself. Because there's a couple of things you have to remember. The original oldest documents of the Old Testament and New Testament primarily were written, of course, the Old Testament in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek, but the oldest copies, the practice that goes the furthest back, is that as they were written on the scrolls or papyrus, whatever it might be, the oldest practice is that every word, every letter of every word was written in all capital letters. And usually no spaces in between the words. And we say, oh, that sounds, absolutely crazy. But if I were to give you a piece of paper that had Lincoln's Gettysburg Address on it, or something else that we're very familiar with, or not even very familiar with necessarily, but if I were to give you something in English that was in all capital letters and there were no spaces between the words, you know what you could do? You could read it. I know you could. We might stumble a little here and there because sometimes the last part of one word runs into the first part of the next word, and it looks like another word in between, and it might throw us for just a moment there, but we could read that. That was done primarily, it was the practice then when these oldest copies were being made, and it also was a little bit of a space-saving issue. You couldn't run down to Staples and buy a box of 10 reams of paper and just write all this stuff off and print it off. Paper, parchment, papyrus, and so on, those were precious commodities. And so you save space by not putting space in between the words themselves. And it conserved space, and it got everything in a uniform pattern, in a uniform way. Originally, that was in all capitals, and the technical term for that is these are called uncials. The uncials are the manuscripts that are in all capital letters. Well, a little later on, that practice began to evolve and change just a little bit to where things were still written with no spaces between the words, but instead of everything being all capitalized, guess what? They flipped the script almost completely, and they wrote it all in lowercase because that took a little less time. If I asked you to write Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in all capital letters, and then I asked you to write another copy of it in all lowercase letters, you could probably write the lowercase lettered version of it quicker than you could the all capital version. So it streamlined the process just a little bit. And it was quicker because, and those were called minuscules. Or, you talk about something small as minuscule or minuscule. These were called the minuscules manuscripts because they're all in lowercase letters. So you have all capitalized or all lowercase. Eventually, they evolved the process a little bit to where it was more something that you and I might equate to cursive, to where the letters connect. All capital letters, it's kind of hard to connect them together. You have to do each one independently of itself. Lowercase letters, you can connect a little bit, and that's why it might be a little faster. But then when you streamline that process to where it's all lowercase, and it's a little more of a cursive writing in the manuscript, you can kind of connect it together, and you can go faster. So you can't base what our English translations are in regard to capitalizations on the manuscripts, because they're either going to be all capitalized or all lowercase. It is a translator interpretation, if you will, of what should be capitalized and what should not be. As that has moved its way into translation into English, we have the English formats of, words begin with capital letters and so on. Proper names are capitalized. All these kinds of things are all into play here. And sometimes out of their religious background, the translators may think the law of Moses ought to be capitalized. It's really a translator call. It's somewhat of a judgment call. Perhaps it makes us understand when we're reading those texts that when we read the word law of Moses, and law is a capital L, and maybe even the word "the" is capitalized as well, but law is capitalized. Maybe it stands out just a little more to us, and we realize, oh, he's talking about the Ten Commandments, or he's talking about, what we read that was given to Moses from Mount Sinai, rather than just a generic law that we could apply and think about anything else. Maybe it helps us understand that just a little bit, but it's a judgment call. It's a translator call, and the translations are not consistent. If you'll pull up on a computer program especially, or on the internet, a cross-reference of a dozen or 24 translations on any one of these verses, you will find it's all over the map. Some things are capitalized, some things are not. And it's the same words, it's the same verses, and for the most part, they are accurately translated. And it's a translator judgment call. So don't be too disturbed, don't be too alarmed when you read things like that. And there's even some places where it gets not sticky necessarily, but it gets a little hard to interpret, like with the word Spirit. Well, should Spirit here be capitalized, meaning the Holy Spirit as a proper name? Or should it be lowercase, meaning like man's spirit and not deity, not even a proper name? And there's a few places in the Bible where that varies from translation to translation. You have to look at the context and interpret it within that framework of the context to make your best understanding and best interpretation of that. So don't be too alarmed or too disturbed if there's a variation even within the translation itself, because I tell you, translators and translations have a hard time being consistent because a lot of people work on a translation and they work on different parts of it, Old Testament, New Testament, and sometimes it's very hard for them to maintain a perfect, flawless, uniform consistency all the way through. For instance, the New American Standard Bible tries to put all Old Testament quotations in the New Testament in all capital letters so that you'll know this is an Old Testament quotation. They're pretty good at it. They're pretty consistent about it, but there's a few places where even that may be a little debatable. But it doesn't do any harm to the Scripture. And really, when we think about this, is it capitalized or not, it doesn't harm the meaning of the verse. It doesn't change the meaning of the verse, and it does not change the application we should make to ourselves, and it does not change the text itself. It's simply English and the translator's discretion and judgment as to how this should be capitalized or not. A good question, though. Somebody's paying close attention. when they're reading the Scriptures, to pick up on and make cross-references to things like that. And I hope that we will continue to read our Scriptures and pay close attention, yes, to capitalized and uncapitalized words, but particularly to the teachings of Christ about salvation, particularly to all the things that God has to say to us about how we need to live our lives to please Him, to help and influence others, and to spread the gospel as effectively as we can. We extend the invitation of Christ tonight that if you have carefully read your Bibles and having looked at the Bible, you realize that you have come short of God's will for your life, and you need now to obey Him and to make your life right with Him, then we encourage you, after that very careful reading and careful application, will you now respond to the Lord who gave you those words, who gave you that Bible, and do the right thing and live for Jesus. Would you come tonight as we stand and we sing?